We left off distinguishing the lower class from the working class, and before that, the working class from the middle class. The working class, whereas their lives are organized around working schedules. Do you want to go to the movies? No, I cannot. I work from 7 to 4:30 on weekdays or weekends, whatever we're talking about. Their lives are organized around their work schedule, and of course they're likely to receive wages, for the work that they do. In the lower class, we said that there's weaker attachments to the workforce. These jobs are often part-time and unstable. These jobs might be off of the payroll or off of the books, so to speak. You might not receive, a W-2 form for your work. You might not actually pay taxes on that money. You might get paid in cash for doing jobs here and there. When we say weaker attachments to the workforce, what we mean is that their lives are not principally organized around work. You know, um, some of these people work for themselves. And that doesn't mean that all people who work for themselves are in the lower class, not at all. Some people work for themselves and make, you know, very good money. But people in the lower class often work for themselves or are not on a payroll of any, company or firm. Many people in the lower class do live in poverty. When we talk about the underclass or the urban poor, these are people who have almost little to no attachment to the workforce. These are individuals who not only are they poor and not only do they have weak attachments to the workforce, but it's likely that we're talking about generational poverty here. Parents or mother, father, grandparents poor as well. It's called the underclass because they're thought to exist beneath the class system. The lower class and the working class, they're still working for the most part, especially the working class, absolutely. But the underclass or urban poor, very, very weak attachments to the workforce. We might be talking about people who have never held a job, within their lives or maybe been out of the workforce for 5, 10, 15 years. Within this class of people, we see such problems and such mobility impeding factors as early and single parenthood, becoming a parent early in life, reduces your likelihood of achieving upward mobility, incarceration, or going to prison, substance abuse, and violence. And when I say violence, that could be as either a victim or a perpetrator of violence. Um, these issues tend to be widespread in communities where the urban poor or underclass live. And again, these problems tend to be intergenerational, so going back multiple generations. One of the causes of kind of the underclass or the urban poor is social exclusion. When someone is socially excluded, what we mean is they're excluded from the institutions that help spur or help bring about their social mobility. So we're talking about institutions such as the workforce, you know, places to get jobs. They're largely excluded from those. They might live too far away. They might not have transportation to get there. They might not have the qualifications to be hired. Excluded from, quality schools. They might attend schools with very, untrained staff. Dropout might be high. So when we say social exclusion, we're not talking, being a little facetious here. We're not talking about people saying, no, you're poor, get away from me. Like, no, that's not social exclusion. Social exclusion is really exclusion from the institutions such as the workforce, educational institutions, maybe the military, um, exclusion from the institutions that can help one achieve social mobility, move into a higher social class. One of the issues with the underclass or the quote unquote urban poor is what's known as the culture of poverty. We talked about this a little bit when we talked about structural explanations for poverty versus more cultural explanations of poverty. Structural explanations are going to focus on institutions. So when we talk about social exclusion, as we just did, that's a structural problem, not having access to um, quality jobs, not having the qualifications to get hired into quality jobs, not being able to afford a good education because the public education in the neighborhood might not be any good. Those are structural explanations of poverty. Some individuals look at the underclass or the urban poor and they try to explain that via cultural explanations. So when we talk about the culture of poverty, we're talking about such things as um, it might be normal in certain families or in certain communities um, to have a child, in your teens. Maybe certain, young girls might aspire to be parents, might aspire to be mothers in their teens because they see the support and the kind of, excitement that other teenage mothers bring about or receive that might look appealing to them. So if that is normative, if that is commonplace, that's kind of an example of the culture of poverty. Maybe it's very normative, maybe it's very commonplace to drop out of high school. In certain neighborhoods, we do see very high dropout rates. Now, I think there are structural explanations for that. But if we're using this culture of poverty explanation, we're going to say that, well, not valuing um, the completion of high school, preferring to work or preferring to just hang out with your friends instead of going to school, so cutting class, eventually dropping out. That's cultural. That has to do with norms and values. The culture of poverty says that people learn, people are socialized, to learn about the norms that basically keep them poor. Early, substance abuse, early parenthood, maybe resorting to crime to make money. Um, there's one school of thought that say that these are learned behaviors. People learn about this in the socialization process, and that much of people's poverty is caused by cultural characteristics. So that's one view of this. I should also say, to wrap this up, this underclass, urban poor social class. Some people doubt the very existence of the underclass. The size of this class, in terms of how many people belong to it, and the very existence of the underclass is something that sociologists debate. I worked for several years in the Fifth Ward community of Houston. One of the 5 years ago, it was the lowest income neighborhood or second lowest income neighborhood in all of Houston, and a vast majority of the individuals who I worked with there and individuals who I came in contact who live there have pretty much the same attitudes and values and norms when it comes to like raising a child or starting a family or going to school that I did. So when we debate the existence of this underclass and we say, well, there's a culture of poverty at work, are the norms and values of people who live in these urban poor neighborhoods that different than people from in the middle class, upper middle class, or you know upper class? That's to be debated. Sociologists conduct research on this, and we're still not exactly clear on it. So the underclass, urban poor, there's some debate as to whether or not this class is truly a class of its own, or whether they just belong to the lower class. Two different views on social class. Karl Marx said that social class is really easy to understand. It's just determined by one thing, and that one thing that determines social class is one's relationship to the means of production and their source of income. Now, that's stuffy language to just mean one's job. If we talk about one's relationship to the means of production and their source of income, we're talking about one's job. Marx says that social class is all about one's job. Because one's job either puts someone in the bourgeoisie, people who own what they're producing, the proletariat, people who own only their labor and they're working for the bourgeoisie, or you have this third class, which is the finance aristocracy. These are people who basically make money off of money. People who work, as investors, financial advisors, um, stockbrokers, hedge fund managers. These are, I call it OPM. These are people who work with other people's money. Marx was not too fond of that group of people because he didn't see them contributing any wealth, just making money off of other people's wealth. But Marx says that what class you belong to, what social class you're in, Marx says that's all about your job. You are either in the upper class, the bourgeoisie, or the working class, the proletariat. The finance aristocracy was a part of the bourgeoisie as well. But Marx says your job determines your class. Max Weber, another founding father of sociology, comes along and says to Karl Marx, not so fast, my friend. It's a little more complicated. It's a little more complex with that. Max Weber says that social class is composed of those who hold similar life chances. You remember what life chances are, the possibility, the chances you have to live a prosperous, comfortable life. Marx says, or I'm sorry, Weber says that social class comes from one's life chances, and one's life chances come from a number of different things. Number one, what is your income? How much money do you make? Number two, marketable abilities. Basically, what are your skills? What are your skills, talents, competencies, whatever you want to call it? What are the things that can help you make money or get a job? Someone might have a very low income, but they might have a lot of marketable abilities. Maybe they speak three languages. Maybe they're great at multitasking. Maybe they are great at selling things. But Weber says that that helps somebody's life chances. That plays a role into the social class they will be in. Another thing is access to consumer goods and services. Weber noted that people who live in cities have a lot more access to consumer goods and services. They can get the things, wear the things, buy the TVs, watch the things, listen to the things that people consider desirable. Having access to consumer goods and services, plays a role in determining one's social class. And then lastly, the ability to generate income. Some people, maybe they can't get a job, but they're good at selling things on the corner, selling things by the highway interest. Some people are just very entrepreneurial. So Weber, compared to Marx, says that social class is a lot more complex. Karl Marx says social class is all about what job you have. Weber says, no, your social class depends on a number of um, different factors. One's social class is also complicated by what we call status inconsistency. We said that, we talked about our subjective indicators of social class, right? How big someone's house is, what they do in their spare time or what they do for fun, um, what type of clothes they wear, the way they speak. Well, another reason that social class can be difficult to identify is because sometimes people show inconsistencies across these different indicators of social class. Let me give you an example of this. I went to LSU in college. LSU had a running back. His last name was Scott. This is about 10 years ago. Played very well in college, gets drafted in the NFL, gets a multi-million-dollar contract. He did not graduate from LSU. In fact, he left early to go to the NFL. And then a couple of years into the league, he was arrested for rape, and his team released him, and he never got a job in the NFL again. That's somebody who exhibits status inconsistency. It's hard to place him in a social class. Why? Well, he has millions of dollars. He was paid millions of dollars, but he only made that once in his life. Is it, he has to make that money last throughout the remaining, 3, 4, 5, maybe 6 decades of his life. He doesn't have a steady, he has a lot of money, but he doesn't have a steady income. Now as a convicted sex offender, it's going to be very difficult for him to get jobs. He bought a very nice house in, suburban Baton Rouge. So he has a nice house. Is he going to be able to keep that? Who knows? He doesn't have a college degree. He didn't finish school. So this guy's got a lot of money and a nice house, but is it going to last? What kind of job is he going to be able to get? There's some status inconsistency there. And that's another thing that makes social class sometimes difficult to identify. Lastly, I want to distinguish between inequality and poverty. These are not the same thing. Inequality, as we've said, refers to differences in the stratification system. It's essentially a comparison. Two different people, two different families, two different schools, two different neighborhoods. They're different in certain ways, so we would call that inequality. Poverty is a specific economic condition characterized by low income and difficulty meeting basic needs. We have absolute poverty. That's where people lack the resources to pay for their essential needs, such as food, water, and housing or shelter, you might say, or shelter, you might call it. But then there's also relative poverty, which is where someone or a family, a household, lacks the resources that are common within a particular setting or social group. If I'm in relative poverty, I don't have the same things that other people around me have.